What's up, guys? It's Johnny Candido of Candido Training.
HQ.
Today I want to talk about the sumo versus the conventional deadlift, and not for powerlifting purposes. Rather, here we're looking for a general strength training, which one we should go with. And I'll say up front that if I was training for general strength, even though right now I'm way stronger with the sumo, or at least significantly stronger with it, I would actually not use the sumo deadlift, and I would only conventional deadlift. However, that's not what I recommend necessarily for everybody. And that's what I'm going to get into here. But first, before we get into that, what I want to do is establish two main basic principles that oversee all of this. And the first one is the fact that if you have any injury history or you just have any pain doing one style of either, let's say with the conventional deadlift, you have lower back pain, and then just simply don't do it. There's no reason to compromise yourself to do a lift that you're not even competing in. And that applies to everything. There's no single movement that isn't replaceable. And don't just get caught up in trends just because your favorite YouTuber's doing it, or just because powerlifting's getting popular, or just because sumo deadlifting's getting popular, that you have to do that one style right now. And the second point is the fact that the conventional and sumo deadlifts are actually not that different.
Man, isn't the sumo like a squat and the conventional's like a tug?
In almost every video I see or every article I see comparing the two, it exaggerates the differences between the two movements, when in reality, with good form, the conventional deadlift is primarily training hip extension, and the sumo deadlift is primarily training hip extension. And that's why you see my video with Brett Contreras looking at glute activation and which is the best for glute strength training and hypertrophy for the sumo or conventional. What ended up being the conclusion was it really doesn't matter. It's really in between. You can use either one or you can use both. Now, with that being said, there are certain scenarios where I'd recommend one over the other. So first of all, we'll look with the sumo deadlift. Now, one of the big concepts I want to bring up here is a training max and your compliance to that training max. So what I mean by a training max is your ability to use a max where you say, okay, I can do this with good form every single time, and this is before my form breaks down. So for some people, that might be 90% with the conventional deadlift. However, compliance to this training max is your ability to actually adhere to it in practice, and that is where things get a little bit complicated. Because if you are a beginner or intermediate lifter, your ability to perceive form breakdown is not the best, because you can't always tell exactly when it happens, and it takes a long time to really get a feel for it. And it's not even necessarily that you'll go overboard all the time. You also might undershoot it, and a lot of people do this as well, is they don't push the conventional deadlift hard enough. So simply put, where the sumo deadlift has a big advantage here is that it decreases the likelihood of rounding even when you're pulling 4 max loads, so it decreases the difference between a training max and a true max. Okay, so that's why I would recommend the sumo deadlift for people who can't perceive how their form's holding up very well, usually beginners and even some intermediate level lifters. Now the next group of people I recommend the sumo deadlift for is for those who simply cannot get into the proper starting position for the conventional deadlift. And I made a couple videos in the past, which I'll link in this video, one on hamstring stretches and then the other on hip flexor Q to get into the starting position after your first rep. And even if you watch those videos, some people will find that it just does not even matter. That's not going to help at all. And I even mentioned that in the flexibility video, that some people, it's just morphology. It's a matter of your structure where you're just not going to be able to do anything about it. And the thing is, with the conventional deadlift, your hip height and all of really the details of your starting position are almost entirely just set on your actual leverages, because there's not really much you can do since the bar has to be over the middle of your foot or around the middle of your foot, and then the bar has to be underneath your shoulders directly, so that then you really can't start with a low hip position even if you tried, because you simply your hips would shoot up before the bar actually leaves the floor. And you can't really widen your stance that much, because then you'd have to move your grip width out. However, what the sumo deadlift does is it just gives you more room to work with, since you can manipulate so many different styles as far as how wide you make your stance and how your foot angle is and where your knee position is. It now opens up the door for a lot of different options. So now it can essentially make your actual hip flexibility come into play and be the limiting factor to how you can get into the starting position, rather than it only being your morphology. Now, of course, you still are limited in that your shoulders need to be over the bar. Those same principles apply, but now you just have much more room in manipulating your torso angle. Now, we'll add that using a rack pull instead of any type of deadlift off the floor actually does solve this issue entirely as well. Okay, so that was the group of people that I recommend sumo only and to just avoid conventional. Now I'm going to go into two groups here. The group that I would recommend sumo and conventional, and then a group I just recommend conventional alone without sumo. So this all comes down to, in my opinion, your squat stance width. If you squat with a wider stance width, I recommend that you just pull conventional and you don't even worry about sumo. Whereas if you squat with a narrower stance width, then I recommend both conventional and sumo. Okay, so the reason for why with a wider squat stance, I just recommend that you train the conventional deadlift is because you're already getting the benefits from a wider stance. You're getting that external rotation, that abducted position, and training your adductors throughout the concentric of the lift. You're already getting all of that in the squat. And actually, it becomes a recovery issue. And with general strength, what you want to do is you actually want to fill in the gaps. You want to have as much variation as possible because you're trying to get strong all around. And this connects back to a video I made on accessories. It was on contrast versus overlap. Now, obviously, we're not dealing with accessories here. We're dealing with primary movements, but the same concept applies. And for powerlifting, we want more overlap because we want to find our strongest position, and we want to find positions that we train the most and focus in on specificity and being able to apply those to both lifts. Whereas with general strength, as I said, we're not really looking for that. We're looking for the opposite. Now, you may be wondering why with a narrow squat stance, I recommend both conventional and sumo rather than just sumo using the same logic. And the reason is, if you look at a wider stance squat, it's way closer to a sumo deadlift in comparison than taking that comparison of a narrow stance squat versus conventional deadlift. Also, of course, there's something to be said for the fact that the conventional deadlift simply is a greater range of motion lift. So even if there is a slight edge towards the sumo deadlift, like with someone with a narrow stance squat, there still is some logic behind just simply involving the conventional deadlift for that reason, for the fact that it's a greater range of motion. Also, I'd like to add that if you do have great mobility and you're not training specifically for powerlifting, that it's perfectly acceptable to just use a stiff leg deadlift, deficit deadlift, or snatch grip deadlift, which I prefer one of those as a main variation, and just use that entirely and not even use a conventional or sumo deadlift for general strength training. Alright, that's it, guys. Make sure to like the video, support the channel, subscribe if you haven't already, and thanks for watching, guys. Peace!
Biggie died, they shot a star. Who you know in West LA? Bring that ruckus to MA. Jeez.
Isn't the sumo deadlift like a squat with like half the range of motion?